We are in week 3 of our Colossians read for the month of July, and so that's the week we usually devote to talking about some of the tough places in the text and maybe answering some questions along the way. So if you make your way to chapter 1, that's where we want to begin. This is that segment where he is pointing them to Jesus.
Yes.
And the answer to whatever this heresy they're dealing with is in Jesus.
Right.
And so he gives us this vivid description, I guess really starting around verse 13. Mm-hmm. You might could argue there's some things earlier than that, but really verse 13 is where we get the list, right?
Yeah.
So look at the list, because there's one item in the list I think throws people off, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So let's just start at 13. He rescued us from the domain of darkness, transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption. That's all good. Forgiveness of sins, yes. He is the image of the invisible God, yes.
So far, so good.
But
this next phrase,
the firstborn of all creation.
Yeah.
Now, I think that throws some people off. I know that some people have argued that what this proves is that Jesus is not divine.
Yeah.
But that he is a created being.
The first and best of God's creations, but not. Yeah.
Firstborn of all creation.
Yeah.
And I think some of our problem here really has to do with an understanding of what the firstborn is.
Right.
Because in our mind, the firstborn is
the first who's born.
Chronologically,
yeah, right,
the first one born in the family.
Right.
Which, by the way, whether in our culture, whether real or legit, the firstborn believes that they have privileges and rights
come with that,
like bossing around everybody else. But so let's deal with that, because I think that's a point of confusion for some people,
absolutely.
Especially if you encounter someone who wants to argue that Jesus isn't divine; he's a creator.
Yeah, which is the real crucial issue here. Yeah, no, the issue is really in the Bible we don't often realize that firstborn is not just a chronological designation. It can be that, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a role or position that somebody is designated to. In other words, they may not literally be the firstborn, but they can be given the role or status of firstborn. And that's the concept here. Not that Jesus or the Son better was created, but that God gave him the status, of preeminence, of inheriting all things.
Right. Because there was a status that attached to it. I think we try to treat all of our children equally.
Right, yeah.
But in that culture,
no.
The firstborn definitely had some privileges and status above all the other children in the family.
And of course, that issue becomes a crucial, in some way, plot point in some of the stories in the Bible. So Esau is the firstborn. Jacob, however, remember, for a mess of porridge, Esau gives up his birthright.
Really good chili.
Yeah, must have been. But the point is, the idea was that status could be bartered, it could be traded, or the father, the patriarch of the family, could move that. And so in another case, you see Jacob doing exactly that. Joseph is not the literal chronological firstborn of Jacob, and yet Jacob elevates Joseph to that status in the family. That's actually part of why his brothers were jealous of him. That's another story. But you see this when, in good ancient fashion, we don't have a tribe of Joseph. You have instead Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. He got the double portion. He got the birthright. Jacob elevated Joseph to that, not because of chronology, but because it's a role that can be given. Same thing, one last example, Psalm 89. God flat out declares to David in Psalm 89 and verse 27, and I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. And so again, there's the idea. I can give out this status if I choose to, God says. That's the idea behind what is said here in Colossians 1 about the Son who becomes incarnate as Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ, the Messiah.
It's not saying that he was created.
Right.
But he is over every created thing.
He gets this status. And so, again, if you keep reading here, this language that all things are by him, to him, for him, through him. He is just like the firstborn, whether you get that job chronology because you were born first, or your father gives it to you, as Jacob did to Joseph, as God chooses to do to David. It comes with rights and responsibilities. There are perks, there are responsibilities. And so all that falls upon Jesus as God gives him this status.
It's another great example of how the Bible becomes its own best commentary.
Correct. That's right.
Because if we go back, in this case, I think it'd really be pretty simple to do this, to go back and read other places where it talks about the firstborn, and I think that would begin to kind of bubble up to the surface. And so it's a great example of sometimes we just need to go back and work with Scripture itself, figure some of these difficult places out. Jump ahead to chapter 2. There's another segment in here that we want to deal with regarding a couple of questions. Look at chapter 2. Let's read 9 to 12. Again, elevating Jesus, he says, "For in him all the fullness of deity dwells in bodily form, and in him you have been made complete, and he is head over all rule and authority." That kind of looks back on the firstborn of all creation. "And in him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, and the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead." Two places in there, actually the beginning and the end, 9 and 12. Let's comment first on 9 because that is declaring something vital about Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is that he is every bit God, that God fully dwells in him. A mystery beyond explanation, to be sure. That's why Paul has to assert it. That's why others doubted it, which is why Paul has to be very clear in Scripture. No, this is the truth about Jesus of Nazareth, that somehow, some way beyond human comprehension, the fullness of deity, he is every bit God, dwelling in bodily form. Can't understand it. We simply have to accept it by faith and confess it.
It also, I think, is one of the places, not the only one, but one of them that puts to rest forever the question of the nature of Jesus.
Yeah, that's right.
Some claim that he was just a great teacher. Some claim he was a prophet. Some claim that he was an angel. Scripture puts that to rest forever here, does it not?
Oh, absolutely.
It's none of those things. In fact, to say that to him is an insult because it's so far beneath who he really is.
And again, you don't want to listen to Paul. Go back to the Gospels. Jesus accepts worship. People. There's so much there. But if you want one-stop shopping, here's it in a nutshell. If you have ears to hear and accept it, this is as simply put as it can come.
So dropping down to verse 12. He mentions, we probably need to kind of group 11 and 12 because he talks about this circumcision made without hands, and then he talks about baptism in verse 12. And I'm always amazed at people who are dismissive about baptism, because it keeps popping up in interesting contexts.
Yeah, it's just a given. It's just an assumption. It's just there.
Yeah, well, people dismiss it as this trivial thing, but in verse 12, what he says about baptism here strikes me as being really, really significant. He talks about how we were buried with him through baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God. And that phrase seems to me to be especially important because a lot of people are dismissive of the act of baptism. I've heard people say, you just go down into the water, a dry sinner, and you come up a wet sinner. There's nothing special about the water. It hasn't been blessed. It's not holy. It's just water. And so what possible difference could it make? And I think verse 12 answers that question. That it isn't about what we do in the water, but what God does because we've been buried in the water.
And that's why, for as maybe, I don't know, dare I call it old-fashioned as it is, I like the old analogy of Naaman. There was nothing special about the Jordan River when he was told to go dip in it 7 times. And you or I go dip in the Jordan River 7 times, nothing's going to happen to us no matter how sick we are. For Naaman, why did that turn into his physical, his health salvation? Why? Because God worked in it out of his obedience. And I think that's the thing that makes baptism important. I think it's what Paul's getting at here, is that it's from the human mind and from the human perspective, it may seem trivial. It may seem not to be as important as what we believe or what we confess or what we're even willing to do or sacrifice. And yet, Paul connects it to God's working here, and that's what makes it, both crucial and effective. Is that otherwise it's just it's what you do whenever you take a bath or go swimming. There's no difference.
Why is it different?
Why is there? And it's because of God's power at work.
Yeah, it's because of the work of God and all this. And then, so it occurred to me, again, some people argue that baptism can't be necessary for salvation because it's a work, and we're not saved by works. That's the argument some of our denominational friends make. And instead of saying baptism isn't a work, actually verse 12, it says it is a work.
Yeah.
But it isn't our work.
Right.
It's the work of God.
Right.
That's at play here. And so I think that's a great passage for talking to people who are hung up about that and to demonstrate, it is a work, but whose work is it?
Right.
It isn't about what we're doing.
No, that's right.
It's about what God does because of this act of obedience.
Yeah.
Useful text, I think, for that purpose as well. Listen, spend some more time reading through the book this week. Watch, though, for how this book speaks to our lives, especially, we've said before that this is kind of like Ephesians, the first 2 chapters.
Yeah.
You kind of got this essay addressing the sort of vague heresy they were dealing with, but certainly exalting Jesus. But then when you hit 3:1, he really comes down, just like he does in Ephesians 4:1. It starts making some really specific applications to life. I think there's an opportunity to really ponder how that impacts our life. So really note 3 and 4 as you're reading your way through the book this week, and we'll spend some time next week making some application.